My sister had just been praised in front of 200 guests for saving my daughter's life when 3 soft chimes changed everything. Grace looked at her and said, "That sound was in the car. You were looking down." Vanessa's face went white. Seconds later, she threw my daughter's handmade gift into the trash. I didn't argue. I only said, "Tomorrow, you'll learn yours." The first sound was metal brushing metal. Then came the soft turn of a brass wheel. The ballroom beside the Willamette River had been full of conversation a second earlier. Nearly 200 guests sat beneath warm lights at my sister's anniversary gala. Then Grace's sculpture made 3 small sounds. Chime, chime, chime. A shard of blue glass caught the stage light and threw it across Vanessa's face. Her smile disappeared. Grace sat in her wheelchair beside the display table, one hand near the microphone. She looked at the sculpture, then at Vanessa's hand gripping the wheel. "That sound was in the car," she said. A chair shifted near the front. Someone stopped whispering. Grace looked up at my sister. "You were looking down." Vanessa did not look at the sculpture. She looked at Grace's hand. For one brief second, there was no polished event planner, no smiling business owner, no woman who knew how to control a room. There was only fear. "What exactly do you remember?" she asked. Grace did not cry or raise her voice. "Don't know all of it." Vanessa glanced toward the phones people had started lifting. Then fear hardened into something uglier. She grabbed the sculpture. One brass edge caught against the foam. The curved strip bent with a dry snap. Grace flinched. Vanessa pulled harder, carried the piece to a black service bin, and dropped it inside. Cheap things belong with cheap people. For a moment, nobody moved. Then my mother stepped beside her. She did not ask if Grace was all right. She looked at me instead. "Your daughter needs to learn her place." My father reached for my arm and quietly told me not to make a scene. My sister had just humiliated a child in front of 200 people, yet somehow, in my father's mind, the scene would only begin if I objected. I did not yell. I did not touch Vanessa. I walked to the bin, lifted turning forward out, and placed the damaged piece back in its box. Then I knelt beside Grace. "Do you want to leave?" She nodded. I helped her into the passenger seat of my Porsche, secured her wheelchair in the back, and closed the door. Before I got in, I looked at Vanessa, my mother, and my father. I smiled because I understood something. Vanessa had made a mistake. Tomorrow you'll learn yours. I had lived long enough to know that truly confident people rarely need to humiliate someone weaker in a crowded room. Public cruelty is not always power. Sometimes it is simply the shape fear takes when it feels cornered. Halfway across the river, Grace finally spoke. "Mom, was she scared of me?" "No," I said. "I think she was scared of what you might remember." My phone buzzed against the console. A message from Vanessa. "We need to fix what Grace said tonight before this gets worse." I read it twice. Fix. Not talk about. Not understand. Fix. 6 weeks earlier, I still believed the worst thing my sister had ever done was hover too closely over my daughter after the crash. 6 weeks earlier, I was driving Grace into Portland for another morning at the rehabilitation center near South Waterfront. Back then, I still measured our days in small victories. How long she could sit without reaching for support. How many transfers she completed. How much help she needed when fatigue started pulling her balance to one side. I kept everything in my phone. Dates, times, repetitions, notes from every appointment. I called it being responsible. Grace called it something else. She glanced at my screen while we waited for Megan Reed to finish setting up the therapy mat. "Am I your daughter or your quarterly report?" I locked my phone. "You are very funny before 9 in the morning." "That is not an answer." Megan smiled, but did not rescue me. She checked the brakes on Grace's wheelchair, positioned the transfer board, then asked Grace where she wanted her hands. That question still surprised me. After the accident, I had gotten used to touching Grace without asking, lifting a foot, adjusting a cushion, steadying her waist, catching her before she had decided whether she needed catching. Megan never did that. Neither did Ethan Brooks. Ethan worked with the adaptive program and helped during some of Grace's sessions. That morning he was using a forearm crutch. On other days, he did not. Grace noticed. "Rough morning? My leg is being stubborn," he said. "Does working here make it behave better?" "Not even slightly." Grace smiled. Then Ethan looked toward me and asked, "Do you want your mom's hands on you yet?" Grace placed both palms against the transfer board. "Not yet." I stepped back. It was harder than it should have been. Grace shifted her weight a few inches at a time. Halfway across, her left arm started shaking. My hand moved before I thought about it. Megan caught my eye. "Not Grace. Me." I stopped. Grace paused, took a breath, and finished the transfer. Later, while she rested, Ethan adjusted his crutch and said something I would remember for a long time. "My family used to watch my body like weather. Good walking day, everyone relaxed. Bad day, everyone looked disappointed before they knew I was." Grace looked at him. I looked at the notes on my phone. I had always believed care meant noticing every change, yet the people in that room who understood recovery best were the ones who did not rush to touch Grace. They asked first. I was her mother. Somehow I was the one learning that lesson last. A phone chimed across the room. 3 soft notification tones. Grace's fingers closed around the edge of the mat. Her breathing changed. The man holding the phone looked down as blue light washed across his hand. Grace stared at it. Ethan did not ask what she remembered. He simply said, "You heard 3 sounds. Then you looked at his hand." Grace swallowed. "Turn it off." The man silenced the phone immediately. On the drive home, a navigation screen in the car beside us cast a blue glow through Grace's window. She turned her face away. When we reached the house, a cream envelope was waiting in the mailbox. Vanessa's company logo was pressed into the flap. Inside was an invitation to the 10th anniversary gala. Grace ran her thumb across the lettering. Then she looked at me. "I want to make Aunt Vanessa something." Grace carried the cream invitation straight to the drafting table by the north window. The table had belonged to her father. Michael used to build model airplanes there, and faint pencil marks still crossed one corner where Grace had once drawn runways for him. After the accident, I offered to lower the table. Grace refused. We compromised with an adjustable side surface beneath it. That afternoon, she spread out thin brass strips, a small hand wheel, 3 narrow metal leaves, and a piece of blue glass. The room smelled faintly of cut metal. Late Portland sunlight passed through the glass and painted a soft blue shape across the wood. I watched her bend the brass into a curved path. "What are you calling it?" Turning forward. "Why not moving forward?" Grace kept working. "Because moving sounds like you already know where you're going." I did not have an answer for that. Over the next few days, the sculpture took shape. The hand wheel turned a hidden arm beneath the brass rod. When the spacing was right, the arm brushed the 3 metal leaves one after another. The first attempt sounded dull. Grace adjusted them. 3 clean notes finally rang through the room. "Why 3?" I asked. She studied the mechanism. "I don't know. It feels like it needs 3. That evening, Rebecca Hale called about the accident claim. The insurer still had no independent confirmation of the black Sue Vanessa said had forced her off the road. Vanessa had provided selected phone records, but not everything requested. The connected vehicle data was still incomplete. Rebecca's advice was simple. Do not sign a final release. After we hung up, I opened the old accident folder on my laptop. Near the bottom was a message Vanessa had sent from the hospital the night of the crash. Please don't let her talk about the phone again. I had read it before. Back then, I thought Vanessa meant Grace was medicated, frightened, and confused. That night, the words felt different. A family can live inside one version of a story for years, simply because that version hurts less. After enough repetition, convenience can start to sound like memory. Behind me, the brass wheel turned. Chime, chime, chime. Grace went still and looked down at her hand. Someone was looking down. I turned from the laptop. Who? She shook her head. I don't know. My phone began to ring. Vanessa, I answered. Vanessa did not ask how Grace was doing. Her first words were, I saw the video of the sculpture. She needs to change it. Vanessa's first words stayed with me. I saw the video of the sculpture. She needs to change it. I looked toward the drafting table. Grace was still adjusting the brass wheel, unaware that her gift had already become a problem. Vanessa softened her voice. It's thoughtful, Claire. It just isn't appropriate for the room. She explained that the 3 metal leaves could interfere with the program audio. Then she said the blue glass would photograph badly under the stage lights. Clear crystal, she suggested, would look cleaner. I asked why any of that mattered for a gift small enough to sit on one table. There was a pause. Then Vanessa moved on to the family photograph. She wanted Grace seated near the outside edge of the first row. It would give the photographer more flexibility, she said, and make the image easier to crop for different formats. Crop what? Vanessa answered too quickly. Crop the photograph. Not Grace. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen with my phone still in my hand. Grace had heard enough from the other room. If they don't like it, they don't have to turn it. She went back to polishing the brass. Less than 10 minutes later, my mother called. I had not spoken to her about Vanessa's objections. Diane told me no one was insulting Grace. They were only trying to keep her from being embarrassed at a formal event. She mentioned the chimes. Then, the blue glass. The same 2 details. I felt something settle in me. She isn't embarrassed by it, I said. You are. My mother went quiet, then accused me of looking for a problem where there wasn't one. After we hung up, I opened Vanessa's social media page. There was Grace in the hospital, Grace at Adaptive Sports, Grace beside Vanessa at a charity event. The captions were always the same kind of words. Courage, resilience, strength. Vanessa had no problem showing Grace's wheelchair when it helped tell a story about Vanessa being compassionate. Yet in a family photograph, the chair suddenly became something that needed careful placement. I began to understand that my sister loved the story of Grace more than she loved the full complexity of Grace herself. Grace was useful when she represented courage. She became inconvenient when she had an opinion. My father stopped by that evening. Robert brought pastries and talked about parking, weather, and anything else that did not matter. Finally, I asked him, why does everyone care so much about 3 quiet notes? His hand stopped over the pastry box. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked toward the room where Grace was working. Some memories are safer unfinished. The words changed the air between us. Safer for whom? My father closed the box. He did not answer. He picked up his keys and left. I stood at the front window until his car disappeared. Then I went back to my desk. For the first time since the crash, I opened every file from that night. I reopened the oldest folder first. The accident had happened on a wet September night outside Portland. I still remembered the rain sliding across my windshield as I drove toward the hospital. the wipers moving too slowly, no matter how high I set them. Vanessa had called me from the roadside. Her voice was shaking. She said a black SUV had crossed toward her lane on a curve. She swerved. The Volvo left the road and struck the barrier. By the time I reached the emergency department, the smell of antiseptic seemed to cover everything. Grace had dried blood near her hairline. Vanessa stood beside a vending machine with both hands wrapped around a paper cup she never drank from. My mother kept repeating the same sentence. Your sister saved her. Vanessa had called 911. She had kept Grace awake. She had stayed beside her until the ambulance arrived. All of that was true. And for months, that truth became a shield around everything else. Whenever Grace sounded angry about the accident, someone reminded her that Vanessa had stayed. She stayed with you until the ambulance came. I said versions of it too. Not because I was trying to silence my daughter. At least, that was what I told myself. The harder truth was that I wanted the SUV story to be true. If a stranger had forced Vanessa off the road, then nobody in my family had betrayed anybody. Vanessa could remain the sister I trusted. Grace would not have to live with the idea that someone she loved had caused the moment that changed her life. Sometimes denial does not come from stupidity. Sometimes it comes from being too exhausted to survive one more terrible truth. I called Rebecca the next morning and asked what the missing SUV actually meant. She was careful. No witness did not prove there had been no SUV. The road had limited camera coverage. Another driver could have left without realizing what happened. There had been no confirmed contact between the vehicles, but the claim still had problems. The braking pattern did not clearly match the sudden evasive move Vanessa had described. The complete device records had not been produced. Her statement about phone use had never been independently verified. That was what I trusted about Rebecca. She did not tell me what I wanted to hear. She told me what the record could carry. I went back through the old emails. One message stopped me. It was from Natalie Price, an employee at Vanessa's company. If you need anything from Vanessa's event calendar or sponsor workspace, let me know. 3 months after the crash, Natalie had disappeared from the company. No farewell post, no announcement. Vanessa had simply told us she found a better opportunity. I opened Natalie's old LinkedIn profile. My finger rested above the message button. Before I could touch it, Grace called from the studio. Mom, Aunt Vanessa is here. I closed the laptop. When I reached the living room, Vanessa was standing beside the drafting table. She was not looking at me. She was staring at Turning Forward. Vanessa was still staring at Turning Forward when I stepped into the living room. She said she had come to go over gala logistics, valet parking, the accessible entrance, the portable ramp, where Grace would sit during dinner, where the photographer wanted the family arranged. Vanessa could talk about details until they sounded harmless. It was one of the things she did best. Then Grace rolled closer to the drafting table. Vanessa looked at the sculpture again. You kept the blue glass. Grace rested one hand on the wheel. It belongs there. Vanessa nodded slowly. And the chimes? They belong there too. The room went quiet. Vanessa recovered first. She started talking about the event schedule and how tight the photography window would be. But every time Grace touched the brass wheel, my sister lost half a beat before continuing. That was when something became clear to me. Vanessa did not know how much Grace remembered, and not knowing frightened her. Her phone made a single notification sound from the coffee table. Grace's head turned immediately. Blue light covered Vanessa's hand as she grabbed the phone and silenced it. Then she placed it face down. Grace watched her. You always put it face down. Vanessa gave a small laugh. Put what? Your phone. When I'm around. Vanessa laughed again, a little too quickly. Everybody puts their phone face down. Grace said nothing. Vanessa left 20 minutes earlier than she had planned. After the front door closed, Grace rolled back to the drafting table. She put her fingers around the brass wheel and turned it. 3 soft chimes sounded. Grace closed her eyes. Her shoulders tightened. Then she whispered, "Don't tell Mom I'm still." Every question in me rose at once. Still what? Still filming? Still texting? Still looking? I almost asked. Instead, I stayed quiet. For nearly a year, I had pushed Grace toward one more repetition, one more second, one more attempt. I had convinced myself that good mothers kept trying. This time, I did not push for one more word. A few days later, Grace agreed to meet Dr. Valerie Ross, a psychologist who worked with teenagers after trauma. Dr. Ross was careful from the beginning. She would not try to recover a memory. She would not guess at missing pieces. Instead, she helped Grace separate 3 things: what she knew for certain, what her body reacted to, what remained unfinished. Grace also made one rule for me: you don't ask me in the parking lot what I remembered. Okay, she watched my face. And you mean it. I mean it. I used to think silence meant doing nothing. I was beginning to understand that sometimes silence was the hardest thing a mother could offer. It required me to believe my daughter had the right to reach the truth at her own pace. Several days later, Grace showed me one worksheet, 3 columns. Certain, body reaction, unfinished. Under the last one, she had written, "Don't tell Mom I'm still." My phone buzzed. An email from the gala coordinator. Subject: Gala gift preview. Urgent revision request. Vanessa had watched the video of Turning Forward. Her instructions were short. Remove the chimes. Replace the blue glass. I looked at Grace. For the first time, I no longer believed any of this was a coincidence. 4 nights later, Turning Forward rested across Grace's lap as I drove us to the gala by the Willamette River. I had not asked her to change anything. If it's my gift, I bring it in. So I let her. The accessible arrival sign was hidden behind a hedge. The route sent us through a service hallway. Grace glanced at the industrial dishwasher. Nothing says honored guest like arriving next to that. I started to complain, but she stopped me. Save it. I want to see what happens. Inside, Vanessa wanted Grace at the edge of the family photograph. My mother said it would make the picture easier to crop later. Crop the picture or crop my daughter? Diane sighed. Claire, don't make everything ugly. Later, Vanessa's anniversary video showed Grace in the hospital. Then my sister told nearly 200 guests, when someone you love is hurt, you stay, you don't look away. I felt cold. Some people stand beside another person's pain as long as they control the story. Vanessa did not need Grace healed. She needed Grace grateful. Grace pushed herself up the portable ramp. Vanessa handed her the microphone. Thank you for staying with me after the crash. Vanessa relaxed. Then Grace added, and I made you something. The box opened. Blue glass caught the light. 3 metal leaves hung beneath the brass road. Grace explained that the road could keep moving without returning to its original shape. Turn it. Vanessa did. Chime, chime, chime. Grace stared at her hand. That sound was in the car. Vanessa froze. You were looking down. She leaned closer. The microphone was live. What exactly do you remember? I don't know all of it. Phones began rising. Vanessa grabbed the sculpture. The brass caught against the foam and bent. She yanked it free and threw it into a black service bin. Cheap things belong with cheap people. My mother stepped forward. Your daughter needs to learn her place. My father caught my arm. Don't make a scene. Vanessa had just thrown a child's gift into the trash before 200 people, yet somehow the scene would only begin if I objected. I lifted, turning forward from the bin. Do you want to leave? Yes. I looked at all three. Tomorrow you'll learn yours. In the car, Grace asked, was she scared of me? No, sweetheart. She was scared of what you might remember. My phone buzzed. We need to fix what Grace said tonight before this gets worse. I took a screenshot and did not reply. Sometimes silence means you stop arguing with a liar and start preserving evidence. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Vanessa was not alone. Diane and Robert stood behind her. My mother was holding a stack of papers. The next morning, the doorbell rang before I finished my coffee. Vanessa stood on the porch with my mother and father behind her. Diane held a neat stack of papers against her chest. They did not ask how Grace had slept. They came inside and went straight to the kitchen table. My mother placed the papers in front of me. The statement said Grace had become overwhelmed by the lighting, sound, and emotion at the gala, and had made a statement she could not verify. Grace rolled into the doorway and read the first paragraph. Who wrote this? Vanessa said their attorney had helped make sure the language was responsible. Your attorney wrote a statement about my memory without talking to me? Vanessa lowered her voice. We're trying to protect you. From what? Vanessa did not answer. My mother reminded Grace that Vanessa had stayed with her after the crash. She said one paragraph was not too much to ask after everything her aunt had done for her. That was when I finally saw the bargain clearly. For months, they had treated Vanessa's call to 911 like a debt Grace was expected to repay with gratitude and silence. My phone rang. Rebecca Hale. I answered and put her on speaker. Before anyone deletes, edits, replaces, or clarifies another record, everyone in that room needs to listen carefully. The kitchen went still. Rebecca explained that preservation notices had been sent that morning. Records connected to the accident, media workspace, device activity, and vehicle data now had to be preserved. She was precise. She could not seize anyone's phone or open private accounts because she felt suspicious. If records were needed, she would seek them through lawful civil discovery. Vanessa's face tightened. If a draft was deleted months ago, the cloud wouldn't still have it anyway. Silence. Rebecca spoke first. Vanessa, I didn't mention a draft. Vanessa looked at my mother. Just once. Just long enough. I had spent months searching for answers in what my family chose to tell me. Sometimes the most revealing sentence is the one someone says before remembering how much they are supposed to know. Diane recovered first. She said Rebecca was turning Grace's trauma into a weapon. Grace rolled farther into the kitchen. Stop talking about my memory like it belongs to all of you. Nobody interrupted her. Aunt Vanessa calls it confusion. Grandma calls it a weapon. Rebecca calls it a lead. What am I supposed to call it? Every instinct in me wanted to answer. I did not. Grace rested one hand on her wheel. Mine. Then she looked at all three of them. Please leave. My mother stared at me. You're letting a child throw away her family. No, I said. I'm finally letting her decide who gets access to her. After the door closed, Grace looked toward the rehabilitation calendar on the refrigerator. I followed her eyes and spoke without thinking. You have therapy tomorrow. She turned toward me. I'm not going. I'm not going. Grace said it without raising her voice. My first reaction came from habit. One missed session can become two. Your tolerance could drop. You worked too hard to lose momentum. Even as I said it, I heard myself turning her decision into a problem that needed correcting. Grace looked away. I stepped closer and reached toward the footplate on her wheelchair. It had shifted slightly during the argument with my family. She knocked my hand aside. "Don't touch my legs." I froze. Grace's voice was still quiet, but there was something in it I had not heard before. Not anger, exhaustion. "You watch me when I move." "They watch me when I remember something useful. What happens when I'm just here?" The question landed harder than anything Vanessa had said. I looked at the rehabilitation calendar on the refrigerator. Then I thought about the spreadsheet on my laptop. The stopwatch. The videos. The resistance bands I had bought without asking. The home exercise plan I had printed because I thought one good movement meant we had to chase the next one immediately. Every time Grace moved a toe, held herself upright a little longer, or transferred with less help, I celebrated as if the result belonged to both of us. When she could not repeat it the next day, I told myself I hid my disappointment. I had not hidden it well enough. I turned every good day into proof that I was doing enough, I said. Grace looked at me, and every bad day into something your body had to fix for me. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "What if I never walk?" Months earlier, I might have answered with statistics, possibilities, or something a doctor had said. This time, I did not hesitate. Then I learned how to hope for your life, not for my version of it. Grace did not smile. I was glad she did not. An apology should not demand immediate relief from the person receiving it. I called Megan while Grace was still beside me. "We're pausing," I said, "until Grace decides she wants to return." I did not say for a week. I did not negotiate. Megan simply said she understood. That afternoon, I realized something that embarrassed me. Control does not always look cruel. Sometimes it looks like carefully arranged appointments, color-coded charts, and a mother insisting she only wants what is best. Later, Grace asked for my fine pliers. Turning forward was still bent from the gala. "Hold it here," she said. "Don't straighten it until I tell you." I followed her instructions. Nothing more. We eased the brass rod back far enough for the wheel to turn. The dent remained. "Leave it," Grace said. "Why?" "Because it happened." My phone rang. Rebecca. Vanessa had produced selected records, but the media workspace logs, draft history, and complete connected device activity were missing. Rebecca sounded almost tired. They answered the narrowest question they could invent. Then her voice changed. "But I found Natalie Price." Rebecca found Natalie Price in Seattle. Natalie agreed to speak with her, but she made one thing clear from the beginning. She had not copied company files. She had not saved secret videos. She had not taken anything when she left Vanessa's company. What she did know was how the company's media system worked. 3 days after the crash, Vanessa had asked Natalie to sign a statement saying no sponsor content had been created during the drive. Natalie refused. She had not checked the logs. "I didn't know what the file showed," she told Rebecca. "I only knew she wanted me to certify something before I checked." After that, Natalie was slowly removed from client work. A few months later, her position disappeared completely. She also explained something Rebecca had been trying to confirm. Vanessa's company used an enterprise media platform with a compliance archive and an audit trail. Deleting a visible folder did not always erase everything behind it. Sometimes the system kept a low-quality proxy. Sometimes it kept timestamps. Sometimes it kept a record of who entered the workspace and what they changed. Rebecca used Civil Discovery to request the provider's records. Weeks later, we got an answer. Vanessa's company account had opened a private sponsor preview before the crash. Her phone was connected to the Volvo. The visible folder had later been deleted, but one 13-second proxy remained in the compliance archive. Rebecca looked at Grace before saying anything else. "This proves there was a media session. We still separate that from what caused the crash." That was why I trusted her. She never gave me certainty, just because certainty would make me feel better. Dr. Ross joined us by video. Rebecca asked Grace, "Do you want to hear it?" Grace stared at the table. "Tell me the transcript first." Rebecca read slowly, 3 notification tones, then Grace's voice. "Aunt Vanessa, watch the road." Then Vanessa, "Don't tell your mom I'm still filming." Filming. That was the missing word. Grace did not cry. She looked down at both hands. "My body remembered it before I did," Dr. Ross answered carefully. "Part of it, and now that part has independent support. I almost said, I always believed you, but that would not have been completely true. I had believed something was wrong. I had also allowed my family's certainty to fill every blank Grace could not explain, so I told her the truth. I should have protected your right not to know yet. I let their certainty fill the space. There is a difference between believing a child and demanding that child hand you a complete story. It took me nearly a year to understand that truth does not become less real just because it arrives in pieces. The vehicle records added another piece. The Volvo had drifted gradually. The braking came late. Then came a sharp correction. There was no evidence of contact with another vehicle, and the pattern did not match the sudden evasive move Vanessa had described. Rebecca stayed precise. The available data does not support Vanessa's version. Then she turned to the final administrative log. The morning after the crash, someone had created a temporary user profile from a computer inside Vanessa's office. The profile carried my mother's name, Diane. It entered the media workspace. Then it deleted the sponsor folder. The insurer scheduled separate recorded examinations for Vanessa, my mother, and my father. Grace was not required to sit through them. That mattered to me. For too long, adults had treated her reactions like evidence they were entitled to watch in real time. This time, she could choose what she heard and when. Vanessa went first. Her original statement said her phone had been inside her handbag before the crash. The records showed something different. The phone was connected to the Volvo, and the media session was active. Vanessa tried to narrow the difference. "I may have checked whether something uploaded," the insurer's attorney asked. "While driving?" She hesitated. "Maybe for a second." Another question followed. Vanessa looked down at the table. "It was 1 second, maybe less." The room went quiet. I did not feel victorious. I looked at my sister and said, "You helped Grace after the crash. That was real." Her eyes filled. "I saved her life." "You helped her after the impact. That doesn't erase the choice you made before it." She had no answer. My mother's examination was shorter. Diane admitted Vanessa created the temporary access in her name. She admitted Vanessa asked her to enter the workspace, and she admitted deleting the sponsor folder. I was protecting this family. I had heard that phrase my entire life. This time I understood what it really meant. "No, you were protecting Vanessa's story. Grace was the one forced to live inside it. My father's part hurt differently. Robert had received a follow-up concern from the insurer, saying there was no objective evidence supporting a second vehicle. He never told me. When asked why, he said, 'I thought blame would destroy this family.' My father had not deleted a file. He had deleted a question. Sometimes a question kept from the person who deserves to know it can do more damage than the document itself." Grace chose to enter the room afterward. Vanessa looked at her. "I never meant for this to happen." Grace's voice stayed calm. "But you meant to make me doubt it afterward." Vanessa said nothing. "My mother tried next. We thought we were protecting you." Grace looked at her. "You were protecting her from me." Then Grace turned to Rebecca. "I don't want any of them contacting me directly. No calls. No messages. No surprise visits. No relatives carrying messages for them. I did not speak for her. I stood beside her. The consequences came slowly. The insurer reassessed liability. The civil case continued. A separate agency review remained open. Several clients paused contracts with Vanessa's company. Her business partners removed her from direct operations while they reviewed the damage recordings from the gala kept circulating. I did not need Vanessa to lose everything. When I was younger, I might have called that forgiveness. At 50, I called it something simpler. I did not want the rest of my life measured by how much another person suffered. Months later, Rebecca brought us the settlement papers. The money could help pay for rehabilitation, braces, wheelchair repairs, transportation, and accessibility. It could not buy back the months Grace spent wondering whether her own mind had betrayed her. After the meeting, Grace looked at me. I think I want to go back to rehab. Okay. You wait outside. I nodded. Okay. I waited outside the rehabilitation gym, exactly as Grace had asked. Through the closed door, I heard equipment shift, someone laugh, and a timer sound. My notebook stayed in my bag. When Grace came out, I almost asked, "How many?" Instead, I said, "How did it feel?" Unsteady. Better after a while. It told me more than any spreadsheet had. Grace still used her wheelchair every day. Some days she could bear more weight through her legs. Some days she could not. With braces and a walker, she could sometimes initiate a few supported steps. Fatigue changed everything. That spring, her school invited her to display Turning Forward. The first program draft called her the courageous young artist who refused to let a wheelchair define her. Grace crossed it out. I still use my wheelchair. Don't make it the villain. The final program described brass, blue glass, movement, tension, sound, and adaptive fabrication. My mother sent an apology letter. Grace read one paragraph. She's sorry she lost me. That's not the same as being sorry for what she did. My father asked to attend rehabilitation. Grace answered, "Therapy isn't where you get to prove something to me." At the spring exhibition, Turning Forward stood on a low pedestal. Vanessa's dent was still visible. Halfway through the evening, Grace looked at me. "I'm going to try." Megan checked her braces. Ethan brought the walker and stayed close without touching her. No announcement, no countdown. Grace looked at me. "Don't count. I won't." She stood. The first step was hard. The next was harder. One leg hesitated, so she stopped, breathed, and tried again. I watched her face. When she reached the sculpture, she could have tried another step. Instead, she said, "I'm done." Megan stopped immediately. The wheelchair came back. Nobody said, "One more." Grace rolled to Turning Forward and turned the wheel. Chime, chime, chime. Her shoulders tightened for 1 second. Then she turned it again, more slowly. This time, Grace chose the pace of every sound. I used to think healing meant the past would someday leave no mark. Grace taught me otherwise. Some things do not need to become unbroken to keep working. Some dents do not need to be polished away. Some roads do not need to be straight to carry us forward. I once thought justice would feel like watching Vanessa lose everything. It did not. Justice arrived in a school gallery when my daughter told me not to count, and I finally loved her enough to listen. Grace did not need another step to prove her worth. I did not need anyone else destroyed to know we had taken back what mattered most. Are you satisfied with how Grace and I chose to end this story? Was she right not to give Vanessa and her grandparents another chance yet? Or should families still have a path back? What would you choose? Justice, forgiveness, or distance?